and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. Top diplomats of South Korea and the United States met in Washington, D.C. to discuss tariff issues as well as the implementation of agreements outlined in the joint summit fact sheet signed by the two countries' leaders in November. President Lee Jae-myung has urged authorities to use all available measures to rein in high housing prices in the capital area. The government plans to end the grace period for the heavy capital gains tax on multiple homeowners, as scheduled on May 9th, with no additional extension. The United States says it shot down an Iranian drone that approached an American aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea. This comes as the U.S. continues to build up a military presence in the region, amid heightened tensions between Washington and Tehran, and as the two countries prepare to resume nuclear talks in Istanbul this week. We begin this morning with a meeting between the South Korean foreign minister and his U.S. counterpart in Washington, as Seoul works to reverse the U.S. tariff hikes on Korean products. Foreign Minister Cho vowed to quickly implement the terms of the trade and investment deal agreed when the two countries' leaders met late last year. Our Park Jun-an starts us off.
South Korean Foreign Minister Cho Hyun met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio at a closed-door meeting in Washington, D.C. on Tuesday. This comes as the Korean government seeks to resolve issues after U.S. President Donald Trump warned that tariffs on Korea would be hiked from 15% to 25%, citing delays in the National Assembly's passage of legislation needed to implement last November's bilateral trade and investment deal. After the meeting, South Korea's foreign ministry said that Minister Cho Hyun urged Secretary Rubio that there will be swift and substantive implementation of the November joint fact sheet, especially in nuclear energy, nuclear power submarines, and shipbuilding. He also explained Seoul's efforts on tariff agreements and U.S.-bound investments and proposed continued diplomatic support for smooth trade talks. Both ministers agreed to implement security commitments to build positive momentum and maintain close coordination on North Korea issues and regional stability. The U.S. State Department also released a statement emphasizing the enduring strength of the two countries' alliance and said both sides discussed advancing bilateral cooperation through a forward-looking agenda aligned with recent summits between Presidents Trump and Yi. Secretary Rubio also thanked Korea for its leadership in developing secure, resilient, and diversified critical minerals supply chains. The most recent round of high-level diplomatic talks followed visits to Washington by Korea's industry and trade ministers, who met with U.S. counterparts including U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, without resolution. The deployment of high-level trade figures to the U.S. reflects the deep concerns in Korea over tariffs, which could disrupt operations at Korean companies. Park Jun-an, Arirang News.
The Korean government has made it official that there will be no further extensions to the temporary tax break for multiple homeowners beyond May 9, though a grace period of up to 6 months may be granted in certain cases, given the tight deadline. Our Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
Employing all available tools to tamp down high home prices in the capital area. That was the key message from President Lee Jae-myung at Tuesday's weekly cabinet meeting, as he also called for thorough measures.
대한민국의 부동산 이 문제는 정말 이 사회 발전을 통째로 가로막는 아주 암적인 문제가 됐어요. 부동산 거래하는 사람이 나쁘다는 얘기 아닙니다. 그건 시스템이 사회가 그렇게 허용하니까 그렇게 하는 거예요. 정책의 신뢰, 안정성이 꼭 담보돼야 되겠다.
The administration plans to end the grace period for the heavy capital gains tax on multiple homeowners as scheduled on May 9th, with no additional extension. Given the tight deadline, the government is looking to allow the temporary tax break to stay in place for up to 6 months for homeowners who signed a contract before or on the deadline.
For 3 areas in Gangnam as well as Seongsan, we are reviewing a grace period of up to 3 months so that people can settle final payments or conclude ownership registration. For newly designated speculative zones, up to 6 months.
The president appears to have in mind those who oppose or compare home prices with stock prices, urging that a distinction be made between an investment that helps the economy and one that harms it, in particular, people who don't have a home.
집값과 주가를 같은 선상에 놓고 판단하면 안 된다. 저는 이게 좀 모르면 그런 생각을 할 수도 있는데 최소한 사회의 지도적 입장에 있는 사람들이 그렇게 얘기를 하거나 또는 그런 식으로 선동하는 것은 참 옳지 않다.
Home prices have been the main topic in a series of recent social media posts by the president, showing his strong determination to address the chronic issue that is often deemed sensitive. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
South Korea's foreign reserves declined for the second consecutive month in January as authorities continued efforts to stabilize the weakening Korean won amid rising exchange rate pressures. The Bank of Korea said this morning that reserves stood at $425.91 billion at the end of January, down $2.15 billion from December. The central bank mainly attributed the drop to market stabilization measures, including foreign exchange swaps with the National Pension Service. This follows December's decrease of $2.6 billion, which marked the first decline in 7 months after 6 straight months of gains. As of late December, South Korea ranked 9th globally for foreign reserves. Protests have been continuing across the United States against President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown and following the fatal shootings of civilians by federal agents in Minnesota. For more on this, we're joined today by Chris Casquejo, an independent journalist in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Good to be with you.
So these anti-ICE protests have been intensifying across the country recently. How are people responding to the immigration crackdown, and what have you been seeing on the ground in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, the protests have been growing in scale and scope, with hundreds of demonstrations held across the country in recent days. This includes marches, walkouts, and calls for general strikes, showing that this issue, this immigration crackdown, is resonating far beyond traditional anti-immigration enforcement activists. In Washington, D.C. here, the protests have been focused and symbolic, taking place on Capitol Hill and outside federal buildings. The mood is very urgent, with many protesters saying immigration enforcement now feels very personal and disruptive to daily life.
I see. And journalists were arrested for federal civil rights violations, while covering the anti-ICE protest at a church in Minnesota. Some are calling this media censorship. What's your take on this? And are journalists facing more obstacles under the Trump administration?
Yeah, this incident involving the two journalists at the anti-ICE protest at the church has really become a flashpoint for press freedom concerns here in the United States. Journalist and former CNN anchor Don Lemon said that a dozen federal agents arrested him despite his offer to surrender voluntarily. But authorities contend that this arrest of Lemon and another journalist were about disrupting a religious service and not about them practicing journalism. Now, press advocates warned that this risks criminalizing protest coverage and creating a chilling effect where it will discourage journalists from documenting what's going on and also citizens from documenting what's going on. More broadly, journalists covering immigration and protests are definitely facing increased legal and physical obstacles. We've seen several reports and instances of the local reporters in Minnesota getting tear gassed while covering these protests.
I see. And how visible is ICE activity in everyday life for people living in immigrant communities in the United States? How is it affecting the daily lives of Americans?
Yeah, it really depends on which city you're talking about. For example, in Minnesota, where this immigration enforcement operation is continuing, ICE activity has become highly visible occurring in neighborhoods near workplaces and routine daily activities like Home Depots, other stores like that, and also schools, which is where immigration and authorities took in Liam Ramos, the 5-year-old who was recently released with his father from a detention center in Texas. Now, immigrant families report changing daily routines, avoiding schools, hospitals, and other public places out of fear. Even U.S. citizens in so-called mixed status families are affected. A mixed status family is a household where family members have different immigration statuses, often one of the family members being undocumented, while somebody else in the household is a U.S. citizen. Now, this impact extends way beyond arrest to widespread disruption of community life in places like Minnesota and Chicago, where the enforcement was happening just several weeks ago.
And what do you think is driving the administration to double down on immigration enforcement right now?
Well, immigration remains a key issue for President Donald Trump's base. The administration frames this as a law and order push and enforcement of existing laws. And officials appear determined not to back down in response to these protests, but at the same time, mounting scrutiny is shaping how enforcement is carried out. For example, authorities, the Department of Homeland Security announced that they would equip the officers with body cameras in Minnesota for the Border Patrol agents and ICE agents there, a step that supporters say could improve accountability, but the critics note that this is limited in scope to the Minnesota operation. Now, taken all together, this suggests that the administration is trying to hold the line on enforcement while making some tactical adjustments, increasing the transparency while reducing their legal risks without changing the underlying immigration enforcement policy because of some of the optics. There were 2 people who were shot in Minneapolis for observing and encountering these officers.
All right, where do you see this heading? Is there any chance we'll see a possible shift in the Trump administration's immigration policy?
Short term, I don't think you will. I mean, they've announced that they are going to expand this immigration crackdown to other cities like Springfield, Ohio. But public opinion is moving, so that is something to watch. Watch the polls. Recent Reuters and Ipsos polling shows that a majority of Americans now disapprove of how immigration enforcement is being handled, with approval well below 40%. Even among the voters who supported President Trump's tougher border controls, there's growing concern that the enforcement tactics have gone too far, especially when it comes to use of force and transparency. Remember, in the case of the shooting of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, the administration had called them domestic terrorists and said that they had brandished weapons, or she had run into the officers, where the video showed otherwise, and that was not the case. For Donald Trump, immigration remains a core political issue, so a sudden shift is unlikely. But as we move closer to the November midterms that are going to decide the control of Congress, you might see a shift in public opinion, sustained public pressure, increased scrutiny from the courts, and the politics will play all into that. So we'll just have to see how it all plays out with all these factors involved.
I see. I guess we'll have to see how that goes. All right. Thank you so much for your time and insight this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.
A U.S. fighter jet has shot down an Iranian drone near an American aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea as tensions with Tehran remain high. The incident comes just days before the U.S. and Iran are set to resume nuclear talks in Istanbul. Our Lee Seung-jae reports.
The U.S. military says it has shot down an Iranian drone that approached one of its aircraft carriers in the Arabian Sea, in the latest sign of rising tensions between Washington and Tehran. According to U.S. Central Command, the incident happened on Tuesday when an Iranian Shahed 139 drone flew toward the USS Abraham Lincoln with what officials described as unclear but aggressive intent. The drone was ultimately downed by an F-35C fighter jet operating from the carrier. A spokesperson for U.S. Central Command said the action was taken in self-defense to protect the ship and its crew, stressing that the drone's approach posed a potential threat. The encounter comes at a sensitive diplomatic moment. Iran and the U.S. are preparing to resume nuclear talks in Istanbul on Friday, as both sides attempt to revive negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled a tough stance ahead of those talks. He warned that with American warships moving closer to Iran, bad things would probably happen if no agreement is reached. The deployment of the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has expanded Washington's military presence in the region and increased the president's range of options should tensions escalate. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu expressed skepticism about Tehran's intentions. In talks with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff on Tuesday, Netanyahu said Iran has repeatedly shown that its promises cannot be trusted and suggested any future deal should be viewed cautiously. Observers say the upcoming talks in Istanbul could be critical in determining whether tensions ease or move closer to confrontation. 이승재, Arirang News.
More than 11,000 people became naturalized South Korean citizens last year, the highest level since 2020. According to data from the Justice Ministry this morning, 11,344 out of 18,623 applicants acquired Korean nationality between January and December. Naturalizations previously peaked at 13,885 in 2020, but fell to about 10,000 in 2021 and 2022, before rising again in 2023 and 2024. By nationality, Chinese citizens made up the largest share at 56.5%, the highest since the pandemic. They were followed by Vietnam, the Philippines, and Thailand. And South Korea marked Korean Sign Language Day this Tuesday, the 10th anniversary of Korean Sign Language being declared the country's official language for the hearing impaired. Members of the deaf community gathered to celebrate the occasion. Our Chung Il-im was there.
Here at the Modu Arts Theater in Seodaemun-gu, Seoul, people communicate with more than just spoken words. Members of the deaf community gathered on February 3rd, designated as Korean Sign Language Day, to celebrate the event's 6th annual commemoration. This year is particularly significant as it marks the 10th anniversary of the Korean Sign Language Act, a law that elevated KSL to an official language. Held under the slogan, "Today connected by language, tomorrow connected by culture," the event highlighted the beauty of visual language. The ceremony featured poem recitals by the Sign Language Arts Group and award recipients Sign Mindle, followed by awards for those who have dedicated themselves to the development of KSL. Instead of the sound of clapping, the hall was filled with silent applause as attendees waved their hands in the air, the traditional gesture of acclaim in the community. One award recipient highlighted the power of language in restoring connection with loved ones.
One of my students had a deaf family member they couldn't really talk to, but after learning sign language, they told me that communication finally opened up, and now they even video call each other.
The ceremony continued with more festive performances, including songs by a deaf community-based music band, Deaf Vengers. While National Assembly member Park Hong-gun emphasized South Korea's efforts to embed KSL interpretation in areas such as welfare and entertainment during a speech, leaders of the community say challenges remain.
사실 많은 기관에서 언어법이 제정된 이후로 많은 통역이 제공이 되어 있는 것은 같습니다. 하지만 아직도 현장에서는 적용이 많이 안 되고 있는 듯한 모습도 많이 보이고요. 사실 10년이라는 시간에 비해서는 아직은 조금 더 발전의 속도가 여전히 더디다는 생각이 좀 많이 드는 것 같습니다. 가장 시급한 문제는 사실 수어 사용 환경의 좀 실질적인 확대가 좀 많이 필요하다고 생각이 듭니다. 또 언어권 보장 그리고 디지털 미디어 환경에서 좀 다양하게 수업 접근성이 강화되었으면 좋겠다는 생각이 듭니다.
That just meant congratulations on Korean Sign Language Day. Celebrating 10 years of the KSL Act, we imagine a future where language is no longer a barrier, but a connection. 정혜림, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. President Donald Trump on Tuesday signed a massive $1.2 trillion government funding package into law, ending the 4-day partial government shutdown that began last Saturday. The U.S. House passed the bill 217 to 214 earlier on Tuesday after the Senate approved it last Friday. The package funds almost all of the federal government through the end of September, but puts the Department of Homeland Security on a 2-week stopgap that expires on February 13th. Lawmakers now face a short window to negotiate a longer DHS deal as Democrats push for changes after federal agents fatally shot 2 people in Minneapolis last month. Former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton have agreed to testify later this month in a congressional investigation into late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer confirmed on Tuesday that the Clintons will sit for transcribed film depositions on February 26th and 27th. The agreement effectively pauses a looming contempt of Congress vote that could have led to criminal charges against the couple. NASA has delayed its mission to fly astronauts around the moon after hydrogen leaks disrupted a fueling test. Engineers at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida detected the leaks during a wet dress rehearsal, a final pre-launch simulation of the massive Space Launch System rocket. This technical failure forced launch controllers to halt the countdown with just 5 minutes remaining. The delay pushes the launch date back to at least March 6th. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has announced plans to ban social media for children under the age of 16 to combat, quote, the digital Wild West. Speaking at the World Government Summit in Dubai on Tuesday, Sanchez also vowed to introduce legislation that would hold tech executives criminally liable for failing to remove harmful or illegal content and would criminalize manipulating algorithms to amplify illegal content. The proposal still needs parliamentary approval, with the legislation process set to begin next week.
Today marks Ipchun, the seasonal turning point that signals the start of spring. And right on cue, temperatures are climbing, bringing milder than average weather to most parts of Korea. However, as the cold briefly eases, fine dust levels are becoming a concern. Air quality will be bad today in Seoul, Gyeonggi-do, and Chungcheong-pukdo provinces all day today. Meanwhile, dry weather alerts remain in place for the eastern parts of Gangwon-do and Gyeongsang-do provinces. Strong winds along the east coast will increase wildfire risk, so extra caution with fire safety is essential. And this afternoon, Seoul will be getting up to 7 degrees Celsius. Daegu, Gyeongju, Gwangju all topping out at 11 degrees Celsius. Well, spring may be trying to make an early appearance today, but winter is not quite done with us yet. Freezing air will return on Friday and it will stay bitterly cold through early next week, with a winter mix in the forecast for Jeju and Jeollado province.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.